Hello, and my name is Ava, and today I'll be breaking down getting into raiding. If you don't know what raiding is, it's one of the endgame pieces of content available for PvE players. Raiding is where you'll go into a raid with a group of friends or other fellow WoW players to fight multiple bosses. Each raid is unique and themed around the ongoing story. You and other players have the aim to kill whatever in front of you to gain gear. There are 4 levels of raiding, which we'll be going over today from the beginning to the hardest levels of content. You have LFR, Normal, Heroic, and Mythic Raid, all with their own levels of difficulty, so let's get started. LFR Raid, or Looking for Raid, is the first step of getting into raiding. It is where you'll be able to use the Raid Finder to auto-search for a group and kill 2 or 3 bosses, or what is called a wing of the raid, without any hassle or stress. At the beginning of the patch, you'll start off with 1 wing, and each wing will unlock throughout the weeks until all of the raid is available. This is to allow new players to get used to the boss mechanics without having such a large time commitment that a normal raid does oppose. Once all the wings are open, you should have gotten a feel of how raiding works and feel comfortable to jump into some of the harder raiding content. LFR raid drops the lowest level of gear, however it's a good way to start getting gear to progress further into the raiding scene. Normal raid is similar to LFR, however instead of waiting a few weeks for each wing to open, the whole raid is open at once. This is because instead of using the Raid Finder, you'll be using Find a Group feature instead, where you'll try and find a group at a similar level to complete the raid. The difficulty has gone up, with the bosses having more health and damage, but it's not too hard where new players would be struggling. You need to get used to some new mechanics, as some of the bosses will have changed when jumping from LFR to normal. Normal raid does also drop higher item level gear, which means that you'll be progressing further into the raiding system. Heroic raid is similar to normal, where you'll be using the Find a Group feature. However, this can be more difficult to get into when looking for a group, as people will be looking for more knowledge about the raids. Also, later down in the patch, when the raids have been out for a while, people may also only be looking for people that have already completed the raid. This is to avoid people being unprepared for Heroic raid. If you're struggling to get into a Heroic raid, try looking for a guild run or alt welcome raid when looking in the search bar. Like the jump from LFR to normal, the damage and boss health has all gone up, and some bosses may also have new mechanics. Most people who do raid will normally try to aim to clear Heroic raid. The item level and gear has all gone up as well. Mythic is the hardest level of raid content available. Mechanics do change, and boss health and damage has increased significantly. Mythic changes due to you only allowing to have 20 people in a raid. This is no less and no more to complete. It is very rare to join a Mythic raid using the Find a Group feature, and instead would require you to join a Mythic raiding guild. These guilds are normally quite difficult to get into, as they expect you to have a high level amount of experience. Some require you to have a trial, and others require you to have an interview and to show what you can do. Mythic raiding guilds also look at logs and passes to gather information on how good of a player you are. You also need to put in the time and effort into this guild. Most guilds will raid between 3 and 4 times a week for multiple hours, and is a very large time commitment. So if you are wanting to Mythic raid, you do need to put in the effort, just like everyone else does. Unlike Mythic Plus, I would recommend not setting up your own group, as for when people join, they will expect you to already know how the raid works, and this is not a great start for beginners. Finding a group or having a friend in the early raids is a great way to get used to raiding and how the mechanics work. Mythic Plus normally requires 5 players, whereas raiding changes depending on the level of difficulty. LFR, normal and heroic normally have between 9 and 39 players, and Mythic will always have 20. There are 3 roles in raiding to choose from, and the first one will be tank. Normally you have 2 tanks in the raid, both keeping aggro to avoid bosses hitting your DPS and healers. The reason why you have 2 tanks is because of mechanics like tank swaps. Tank swaps is a mechanic where if you don't do it correctly and your tank does not swap, your other tank will die. It's also a great way for them to balance defensives between each other. Your DPS are there to optimize damage to kill the boss before the boss kills you. DPS should also be aware of mechanics that affect them and work around doing damage whilst also completing the mechanics correctly. Healers' key role is to keep the rest of your team alive, following your DPS and tanks and ensuring they live through hard mechanics. When your team is not dying, however, healers can also DPS in the meantime for efficient gameplay. As a beginner, or somebody that has not entered the raid for the first time, you should do one of 2 things. Read the raid journal to find out what bosses do what mechanics and how to survive them. If you struggle with reading or understanding what is happening, you can also watch one of the many raid guides on YouTube, which normally last between 2 to 4 minutes and will go over what happens in the boss. Doing this allows less mistakes and stops time wasting for not just you, but the rest of your party. The last thing you want to happen is to be sitting in a raid for a few hours dying to a boss because you don't know what's going on. Being prepared is a key part of raiding, and you should always try to be the best you possibly can to avoid mistakes. When going into a raid, knowing how much damage you can do is very important. Also, knowing how to increase that damage is key. You can do this by buying enchants, pots, food, flasks and runes. This will help you increase your damage and healing and make you fully prepared for the raid. All of these items can be bought on the auction house, and guides are available on Icy Veins and Wowhead to be able to understand which ones you should be using. Whilst on Wowhead and Icy Veins, you can also be looking at your talent tree. Your talents will change depending on what the fight needs, and this means that you could be doing either AoE, cleave, or single target. Using the talent system, you can pre-save talents, meaning that you can have each talent set to a boss name to be organised and cause less confusion, so you know what bosses you can change your talents to. The gear from the raid drops at different item levels depending on which difficulty you are completing it at. The boss will also drop a different amount of gear depending on how many people are in the raid at once. What you'll do is after you kill a boss and the raid loot drops, you'll have a chance to roll on that gear. And if you're lucky, you'll be able to loot the gear that you want. However, it is a luck based system, so you may not be guaranteed that piece of gear when rolling. Before looting on a boss, you do want to look out and see if you do need that piece of gear, as you don't want to waste a roll on a piece of gear that you may not want. Knowing what gear drops from each boss beforehand is great, so you can do this by using the raid journal and looking at what gear drops from each boss prior to killing the boss. You can, however, only loot the boss once a week on that difficulty. This means that if you kill boss number 1 on normal, you can't then join a new normal team and have a second chance to gain that gear. You can instead, however, join a heroic level and kill boss 1 and try again a high item level piece of gear. If you're unlucky, you can come back next week, as each week they'll reset and you'll be able to try again. This is where the Great Vault becomes your best friend and gives you a second chance at getting the gear that you are looking for. The gear that drops from the Great Vault is dependent on what boss you killed the previous week. With the launch of Season 2 of the WoW Within, you now have a renown track, which allows you to get buffs, mounts and titles, and other goodies for completing the raid each week. Some rewards will give you buffs to help you complete a boss, and others will give you cosmetic stuff like mounts and titles. This is basically an incentive to help you keep trying at the raid each week, as eventually you'll be able to gain more damage to help you kill a boss. So I have a clip of me fighting one of the bosses in the current raid, The Liberation of Undermine, where I was fighting Rick Reverb on heroic level difficulty. I just want to break down some of the things that you may notice in the fight to help you understand how raiding really works. So if you can see, there are currently 12 people in my group. 2 of us are healers, 2 tanks, and the rest are DPS. As you can see, my role in this was to heal any incoming damage and make sure that everyone was getting topped up where possible. As you can see, that some of the players have just received their mechanic where they will be receiving damage, and that is indicated by a giant blue circle surrounding them. This is something that you want to keep an eye on and try not to run into other people. You want to be the person solely taking the damage to reduce the amount of work the healers have to do. As you can see now, the second part of the mechanic is that they spawned ads that you'll need to target and fight down before the cast goes off and it does AoE damage. As you can see, I've currently moved away from the raid to try and single out any extra DPS and then keep healing everyone. The next mechanic that you can see is the big swirlies on the ground, where they'll be flying out and you want to avoid them as possible, as they will create more damage. On the details meter, everyone is trying to do as much damage as possible while still following the mechanics. Coming up next is a jump mechanic where you want to be standing in this circle instead of avoiding it, to be able to be leaped over the giant laser beam that's coming towards you. In this fight specifically, you do this multiple times to avoid the multiple events that happen. During this time, however, the boss is also unable to be damaged because he has a magic shield around him, causing him to take no damage whilst in this phase. So really, all DPS should be trying to stay inside the circle, and all healers should be healing while as much as possible to avoid as little deaths. At this point, it's basically a repeat where all of the same mechanics that just happened will happen again, and this is basically how the boss is. What you'll do is you'll just keep damaging and following the mechanics. Not all raid bosses are built like this. Some have different mechanics, some have enraging timers. If you don't know what an enraging timer means, it means that once the boss has been going on for so long, it starts doing extra damage until the team wipes. That is something where your damage will have to try and put as much DPS as possible to be able to kill the boss before the enrage timer happens. There are loads of different mechanics that you'll have to keep an eye out for, and knowing when mechanics are happening is a key part of raiding. Lastly, really quickly, I'd just like to go over a little bit of optimizing if you're trying to get better at raiding. You can start by looking at parsing. If you don't know what parsing is, it is an indicator to see how much damage and healing you've done compared to other players in the game. You can do this by looking at Warcraft logs or WoW Analyzer to see how you can improve. Don't worry too much about parsing, however, as it may not reflect what has happened in the actual instance. You may have died, or you may be doing different mechanics to other people. The way that I would use Warcraft logs is just to get an indicator of where you can improve and what you could be missing out. That's all I have for you today. Thank you for watching, and hopefully you found this helpful for getting into raiding. Good luck in the raid, and goodbye.